So today we'll be hearing from Dr Erin Walsh, who I'm sure we all know, and she'll be presenting something she's very passionate about, harnessing the power of a good vision. Thanks, Erin.
Thank you very much. I am super excited to share just some thoughts with you guys today. The general structure is, if I can, we're going to start off with just talking about the power of the visual in general. Then we're going to narrow our scope a little bit to scientific visualization and generally what I mean by that. I'm going to introduce you to the topic of visual brokerage, and hopefully at that point you're going to just be so amazed and enthused and you want to jump in straight away. We're going to conclude with some things that you can do to jump on board and potentially use some of the power of the visual in your work. Normally I ask for questions as I go, but this time, just because there's quite a few threads to pull together, I put explicit question marks on my slides. So if you could please hold your questions for each segment to when you see a gigantic question mark, at which point, ask away. So when I was thinking about how to describe the power of a visual, I realised I was going about it the wrong way. It's better just to show you what the power is. So I'm going to run through a few examples of how visuals can grab attention, elicit emotions, start thoughts, and communicate messages. At the beginning, we're not going to be talking about scientific messages specifically, we're just talking about messages in general, and then we'll narrow it down. Sometimes the visual power can be elicited by unknown sources for unknown reasons. So this is street art, no one knows who did it. The photo was collected via the Creative Resistance website, which goes around finding amazing graffiti. This is a photograph of a heart transplant. It was successful. Everybody there is alive and okay, which is amazing because it was a pioneering heart transplant surgery that took 23 hours. This is taken in 1980 by James Stanfield of, I'm so sorry, it's a Polish name, Zbigniew Reglia. I'm so sorry, anybody who can pronounce that correctly. You can say there was a 23-hour successful heart transplant using pioneering methods. Okay, that sounds really impressive. Or you can just see how exhausted the surgeon is. The surgical assistant in the background there is having a nap. She's just pretty much passed out. Sometimes it doesn't have to be photographs. I come from somewhat of a fine arts bent, so sometimes a powerful visual can be a concept or an idea that is artistically represented. This is The Persistence of Memory by Salvador Dali. I chose it not just because you would recognise it, but this painting means so many different things to so many different people. I look at that as deadlines, got to get the deadlines done, oh the deadline went past, deadline is melting. But everybody will engage with this in quite a different way, depending on the artist's intent or not. This is a very powerful visual that was created purely artistically. The next one, I'm just going to warn you, is a little bit upsetting. But this is one of the most striking images. It was voted by National Geographic as one of the most powerful images of several decades. This is called Starving Boy and Missionary. This was taken in the Karamoja district in Uganda in 1980 by a photographer called Mike Wells. Now you can say there are children who are starving in Uganda, or you can see an image like this that not only encapsulates the plight of what's going on, but also shows that there is help and humanity there. Of course, I come from a psych background and we're always taught if you're going to depress people, have a mood repair. So here is another way that visuals can be powerful, and that is as a humour aid. This one is perfect for this audience, I think. It's one thing to say, yeah, academics, we're often workaholics and really bad at taking time off, but it's nice to make a bit of a joke about it, have a bit of levity. But again, if you just said, okay, I want you to picture someone reclining in a chair and they're really happy, and that's because they're a member of the general public. Okay, now it's an academic, it loses its punch immediately. So the power here is not just in the humour, but it's the speed with which you can actually gain the information from the image. And this is the case with everything that I've shown you. So ultimately, if you go to the literature, and we head to some words now, the power of the visual can be summarised in terms of its capacity to capture attention, to convey information, to persuade, so it's not just about knowledge transfer, sometimes it can be about trying to change someone's perspective or mind or give them new ideas, and generate emotional responses, which I gave you a little potted tour of there. If any of you don't believe me on any of them, you can access the slides and there's some good citations there for chasing that stuff up. I kind of touched on it before, but something that underlies a lot of this power is that visuals have high informational density. It can do all of this with very little space on the page. You can look at it and instantly get a reaction. So in graphic design and more broadly, when we talk about informational density, a lot of people tend to think about things like this. This is my favourite example. This is a book called More Information Than You Require, and it has some of the most informationally dense cover that you will ever see. It's an example in and of itself, but if anybody ever says informational density, I want you to think of More Information Than You Require, both as a book and the way it's manifested. Feel free afterwards to come and have a look, because it is actually quite hilarious, a lot of the information on this book. However, you can see in this example that the high informational density comes at the cost of legibility. There's no way you could look at that and immediately have a reaction. You'd have to spend quite a lot of time digging down, and outside of the context of, well, it's a funny book cover, you won't see many people standing there for half an hour reading it all. But with a visual, you can have similar informational density that has layers that you can engage with. So my example for this is this beautiful image. It's actually the same image. Across the bottom is the full image, and the top is just a slightly zoomed in view, so you can see some of the gorgeous detail. This is called The Cosmic Web by a fellow called Miguel A. Algaron-Calvé. They summarise gravity simulations covering over 240 million light years of space. The idea behind this was to visually summarise a huge amount of data, not only spatially huge, because it's literally the entirety of space, kind of, but also huge in terms of the computational load behind it. The first thing this does is it immediately grabs your attention because it's quite beautiful, I think. Then when you find out that it's called the Cosmic Web and it's about spatial gravity, you want to dig into it a bit more. And there's lots of text and blurbs to go with this, but the longer you look at it, the more you can engage with it. And all of the information that's in the text is shown here. It's just about learning how to interpret it. So when I say that images have high informational density, this is the kind of thing that I mean, where at first glance, it's actually very quick and easy to engage with, but the more you dig, visuals can have far more information under the hood. So far I've talked about how awesome and amazing visuals are, and I hope you're all convinced. But from the perspective of people who might want to start to harness that power, we need to remember, with great visual power comes somewhat great visual responsibility. The other example of this is really crappy use of visuals. Now, please ANU media people, if you're watching this, I did this for demonstration, don't come for me. The Australian National University logo is somewhat emblematic of our authority. It's not just branding of an institution, it's branding of tacit recognition that the information conveyed alongside it is vetted, authoritative, and something that can be trusted. The second that you undermine the visual integrity of that logo, you undermine that trust. I don't know about you guys, but if I get given an information sheet with a smushed, squished logo that looks a bit dodgy, and there's handwriting and annotation, immediately the legitimacy of that messaging with it goes down. So I'm going to give you 1 or 2 conceptual tips for how to avoid this later on in the talk, but it's a good idea to remember that even if a visual itself is great, you need to treat it somewhat with respect for it to have that power and retain that integrity. Is anybody in the audience familiar with this example? So this was a restoration attempt that went a bit wrong. This shows that you should vet people before you let them touch your priceless paintings of Jesus. This lady came in and tried to fix a painting of Jesus. Her name was Elias Garcia Martinez. And she attempted to restore the painting in 2012. Now, the first thing is not just, if you're not artistic, don't touch it. That's not what I'm trying to say. First thing is, if you have a visual, treat it with respect. But the second thing is, sometimes this stuff can have a benefit. So, the town that this painting was in was struggling in terms of tourism. When this beautiful image came out, everybody wanted to go see. Now, they wanted to go see it for the wrong reasons, and they started to engage with it for all of the wrong reasons, but it ended up being a really powerful visual to remind people that art restoration is actually a really hard job and you shouldn't just let a nice lady come and have a go. But secondly, that the message and purpose of a visual can evolve over time in ways you didn't foresee. So pay attention to how you're treating the visual, first of all, and how you present it, but think about how it could be shifted and changed and repurposed in future. And then the third message on this slide is, always put your source for where you get your pictures from. Just the same way you need to treat the visual itself with respect, you should treat its originators with respect. And the same way that we have taught time and time again, never plagiarize someone else's work, always cite someone else's ideas. there is still a bit of an entrenched problem, particularly in academia, of just whacking images in slides and not thinking about where they came from. Now, from an IP perspective, that can be an issue, because often if we're lecturing, we're supposed to have the intellectual property for the visual itself. But also just from a provenance perspective, if someone went to all of the effort to make a really cool visual or a hilariously terrible one, we should link that to the person who made it the same way we would if we were quoting them in words. Any questions about the power of visuals broadly? Rights, responsibilities? I'm going to move on in a second unless... Okay, so we talked about visuals. I'd like to narrow the scope a bit more now and talk about scientific visualizations. So as most of you probably know, I've been a freelance scientific illustrator for too many years, and I found out about 5 years into doing it, we have a guild handbook, which is like really cool to find out. And so from the Guild Handbook of Scientific Illustration, I found a really useful definition which I think applies to pretty much every scientific visualization. And that is to use scientifically informed observation combined with technical and aesthetic skills to accurately portray a subject. Accuracy and communication are essential. So the central part of this for me, and for you I would think, is it needs to be scientifically informed, accurate, and communicating something. This means that my definition of a scientific visualization is actually quite a bit broader than you might be thinking. So, second that you say scientific visualization, first thing people think of is something historical like this. So this is a temperature recorded summary of inoculations from 1952. So we're going OG here, hand-drawn, but it looks like it's not in some instances. But it can be similar information portrayed in a different way, so something that we're gravitating more and more towards these days are infographics. So here is one about the Zika virus. Both of these are scientific visualizations, even though aesthetically they're completely different, and their intention and their audience is completely different. So one's clearly for a scholarly audience, the other is clearly for a more general population audience. They both have that technical information that's accurate, scientifically informed, and intending to communicate something. So to push this example a little bit further, pretty pink bow means female in many people's heads. Now, rightly or wrongly, this is something which you tend to see in cartoons, pretty pink bow, eyelashes if possible, to say that something is female. You wouldn't expect to see a pretty pink bow in a scientific visualization, unless the point is to say that the female mosquitoes are bigger, have less bushy antennae, and they're the ones you've got to worry about for spreading malaria. So if I was trying to tell an audience of children you need to look out for the female mosquitoes, here's how you can tell it's female. Something like a pretty pink bow is actually part of a scientific visualization. It's scientifically informed and the intent is to communicate. Now of course that would be completely inappropriate in other contexts, but for communicating with children or a lay audience, there are times when you can have heuristics and visual aspects that you wouldn't expect playing a part in scientific visualization. So I kind of wandered away a bit from the power of visualization. A point I would really like to make is that they can be really beautiful. So this is a depiction of different flight patterns of different wings. We have a bat, a dragonfly, a goose, a moth, and a hummingbird, and I've made the moth a bit larger. Now the beauty in this is not just in the colour scheme, but the technical accuracy of the information itself. Seeing the different flight paths described by the wings is part of the beauty. It's very much like I say, understanding how a rainbow works doesn't make it any less beautiful. If anything, it makes it more beautiful because you understand how it's happening. So sometimes a scientific visualization, by virtue of its technical accuracy, can be all the more beautiful. Another aspect which sometimes I think people overlook a bit is that scientific visualization occurs throughout the research process. It's not just a beautiful figure that you make at the end. For example, specifically in the case of population health and epidemiology, you might be sketching out a map of the landscape or area wherein you're taking field work. If you're as skilled as Da Vinci, you might be starting to sketch out the biological systems that you're working with in order to orient yourself. And of course, if you're working with anything involving numbers, you should be plotting your data and looking at its relations in things like scatter plots and histograms. So these are just some examples of how the visual itself is part of undertaking the research rather than a single thing that occurs at the end. So far I've talked about technical communication and accuracy. Something which is in the Guild Book definition, which I think puts a lot of people off, is aesthetics and thinking that something has to be beautiful in order to be a scientific visualization, or at least clinically clear. Sometimes what you think is a dodgy sketch is a completely valid scientific visualization. So this is just one example that I pulled of onion skins, because I think they look kind of cool. We've got a school book kind of sketch that labels out the important parts, says magnification and says the level of measurement, and then we have something pulled straight from a textbook. I would actually argue that the dodgy sketch is more informative because it's got more information. It gives you the magnification, it gives you the scale, and it points out things which, if you're actually looking at the sample through a microscope, you're going to come into, such as being able to differentiate an oil droplet from cytoplasm and the nucleus. Now, of course, it depends on what you're trying to do, but quite often the visualizations that you generate throughout your research, don't be shy about them just because they look a bit munted, because they're actually really rich and informative. And when it comes to visualization, as long as the point you're trying to communicate is clear, it's technically informed and it's accurate, it is a perfectly valid scientific visualization. So, any comments or questions about how I'm defining scientific visualization? You're a very easy audience so far. Okay, so the next concept I would like to introduce, and somewhat the point of this talk, is the idea of visual brokerage. This is defined as the process of conceiving, creating, disseminating and interpreting knowledge via visual means. I'll flag here that this is a very broad definition. That knowledge could be any number of things. For now I'm focusing on scientific knowledge as my framing, but this concept isn't just about scientific visualization. So again, this is kind of hard to explain in words, so I'm going to use some visuals to help me out. Traditionally, people tend to think of the visual and the science as somewhat two separate things. Now, I've already argued that this isn't the case, but this is a traditional mindset. In science, as part of undertaking scientific work, you see people using some science visualization, and when you talk about scientific illustration, the paradigm is typically the science feeds some technical knowledge over to the visual people. They make a scientific visualization that is aesthetically more pleasing, and if we're really lucky, they might use some of that communicative power of the visual to feedback and inform and help the scientists make their own visualizations a bit prettier. So what we end up with is two disconnected sources of technical information and aesthetic interpretational power, which are loosely connected. Scientific visualization and visual brokerage changes this a bit. So let's chop away those arrows. We've got these two standing too far away from each other. First thing, get up in there, work together, snuggle up. Okay, so we've still got that paradigm of scientists doing the scientific visualization and people undertaking visualization more broadly, maybe doing something a bit scientific if they come across something that interests them. Nope. We want this in the connection between the two. This is, instead of one just feeding into the other remotely and everybody doing their thing separately, we want the artists working with the scientists. Okay, that's not particularly controversial. So the science is feeding into the scientific visualization. And as I mentioned before, the scientific visualization is often informing the science, whether it's sketching out your ideas, drawing flowcharts, plotting out plotting out your data. The point of bringing in someone with graphical expertise or obtaining that yourself would then be to start to inform your scientific visualizations and make them aesthetically a bit prettier, more legible to a general audience. That said, we also sometimes get the science informing the visualization itself. So you see some really wonderful projects, and I'll show you one later on, where the artist comes in with a set of ideas, but when they find out, oh, the work you're doing could actually inform the kind of pigments I use and the shapes that I use, and okay, you visualize this idea using a scatter plot, maybe I could use something that is visually reminiscent of a scatter plot. You start to get the science informing the visuals, not just in a scientific way, but in an aesthetic way. And this can happen for the visualization itself. So if it's not the scientists themselves saying, okay, well, this is a really cool looking worm, can you integrate this into your artistic practice? Maybe the artistic illustration of the worm created in the visualization starts to inform the artistic practice. And sometimes, this is the really controversial part for a scientific audience, sometimes the graphic designers and artists and visualizers can have a really good idea that actually helps with the science itself. Most often this is due to the fact that if you're thinking visually, you're thinking in a different way and can contribute different ideas. And also often a designer or an artist without scientific training is a great proxy for a lay person or a member of the general audience. So they can give a bit of a grounded perspective there. So this is where I think we're at, particularly in places like RSPH, in terms of scientific visualization. We can push this further and make it even more brokery though. What happens outside this loop? Right now we've just got artists, scientists, graphic designers, or people who are both at the same time working in a loop. Let's go beyond. Communicating beyond the direct team involved in the research. So this is what you see often when you see covers of journal articles and posters and infographics that are disseminated beyond the direct research team. Again, fantastic. Too many people stop at this point because what we really want to hear is feedback. Okay, based on your understanding and how we've portrayed it, what does this mean to you? How does this help you? That feedback can go directly back into the science. Now we're starting to get into a sort of co-design loop where what you're doing and the messages that are coming out of what you are doing are feeding back into the science. But there's one final step, and that is this feedback into the visual. No matter how much you respect the visuals, no matter how much technical or aesthetic accuracy you put into it, sometimes you draw something that looks fantastic and everybody hates it or can't understand what on earth is going on. Common example of this is inadvertently putting crude shapes that you didn't see in a picture and then being told that's quite phallic and you didn't even think of that at the time. Or particularly when you're communicating with audiences you're very unfamiliar with, you might use a colour scheme that to you means heat and warmth, and they just look at it and say, well, what do you mean itchy and sore? I don't see what's going on here. So the communication with community and people beyond the team, it's not just about getting feedback to improve the science, but also the visuals themselves and their practice in communicating that science. So what we have are the aspects of visual, which we've got before. The new part in the paradigm that I'm pushing in this talk is the brokerage bit. It's all of these arrows, it's all of these linkages, bringing everything together as much as one can do. And of course the scope here is limited to scientific knowledge and practice. So this is the general framework that I am working within. Next thing which I quite enjoy talking through is we've actually been doing this for a really long time, just not actually having it drawn out like that with a nice set of arrows and some clear linguistic definitions of what we're talking about. So when I say long history, I mean a really long history. An example which I usually use to talk about scientific illustration is Indigenous cave art often included things such as the location of certain animals, how to treat certain landscapes in certain ways in order to pass on knowledge. They are often evolving, so in some cultures you don't draw over and never touch it when it's done, but in other cultures restoring and going over it and changing it slightly over generations is actually part of the visualization process. An example which people outside of Australia, and indeed most people immediately latch onto, is Da Vinci. There was someone who was both an artist and a scientist. They were a visual knowledge broker, all wrapped into one package. So often Da Vinci would sketch out his ideas for things like flying machines or how the human body worked. The visual was very much part of not only how he communicated his work, but also how he undertook the work. Another example, much more recently, is Banks, as part of Darwin's expeditions to Australia, actually starting to try to scientifically catalogue and record the flora and fauna that he saw. It also has a long history in population health, more specifically. So whenever I try and talk about how powerful the visual is in population health, Jon Snow is the first thing that comes to mind. So I know I'm borrowing a little bit from you geospatial people, but you geospatial people are technically also very visual people, so I feel okay doing that. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Jon Snow identified the location of a cholera outbreak and ended up nutting out what was causing it in terms of the actual pathological mechanism by plotting on a map where cases were detected. This lovely lumpy thing here I need to make sure I'm getting this correct. It's a DNA microarray. This was a partnership between scientists in pathology and a photographer, an image specialist who was more of a designer. So this depicts DNA microarrays in quite a beautiful way with a team of scientists and artists. Which brings me to my next point, and that is many of the historical examples of visual brokerage that I've shown you are the scientist and the artist being the same person. So whether it is an Indigenous cave artist passing on knowledge that they personally know through their art, or Da Vinci, most people think, oh yeah, well, they're doing both of the things at once. That's less and less the case in the modern manifestations of this process. So that DNA microarray was brought together by a team of people which had someone who was a specialist in the scientific content and someone who was a specialist in the artistic content. So generally when I talk about visual brokerage, I am talking about a team. It's entirely possible for one person to do it, but we don't really live in an era of maverick single person, even just on a whole project, pushing their own ideas. So I'm viewing this as very much a collaborative thing now, whereas historically it was much more of an individual thing. So here are some of the benefits of visual brokerage, and the first is ownership. The researcher is more closely tied to how their work is portrayed. I don't know about you, but I was always very leery during my PhD of trying to go talk to the media or talk to other people who would take my message, repackage it in a way that worked for them and then share it with the world, because I was never convinced that they were actually getting the point across, or that they would find the correct point that I was trying to get across. I always worried that the technical accuracy would go in relation to, well, if it's aesthetic or appealing, that's what they're going to go with. Nice thing about visual brokerage is that the researcher is tied to how their research is visualized throughout the entire process, so they have much more ownership over that. Similarly, from an artist or a designer perspective, they get the benefit of knowing that their work will be more meaningful and authoritative. And I've spoken to a whole bunch of people who have been brought on in the past year or so with ANU's recruitment drive to get more graphics people into campus, and almost all of them have said, well, I was attracted to this job because I knew what I was doing was going to have meaning. I knew it was going to help people and actually have a message that people would listen to. So it's not just about what visual people can do for scientists. The scientists are also helping out the visual people. And of course, the big one is impact. So the definition of what research impact is and what impact more broadly has really broadened in the past decade. It used to just be journal citations, maybe conference presentations. It was very much about communicating with other scientists. It's broadening out more and more now to include things like attention, engagement, and the reach of the ideas that we have. And visual brokerage, because it is using the power of the visual, helps push the reach of your work so much further. You'll note that funding globally and in Australia is now reflecting this broader definition. Pretty much anybody who's applied for a Cat 1 grant this year will see that the requirement to demonstrate impact in this broader way is being brought to the fore. Also interestingly, a review undertaken in 2015, so it's slightly out of date, has shown that there is a modest increase in scientific visualization and media outreach. So it's not just that we have to do it and people are grudgingly starting to adjust to do it, but we are actually seeing in research and how researchers, particularly in the human health end of things, are starting to think about impact more broadly and actually starting to undertake it. So I said what visual brokerage is, I've said why it's awesome. I'm sure a lot of you have some reservations, and that's completely fair. So you can think about barriers to actually doing this. I reckon each one is countered by a massive opportunity if it's done thoughtfully and intentionally. The first is poor fit. Sometimes the work that you do really just isn't visual. There is no way that you can have a pretty figure, or if it's visual, it's really disgusting and gross. So this is a problem parasitologists have, where they usually think it's fine, but if you talk, no, we don't want the bloody leg, thank you. So sometimes there really is genuinely a poor fit between the kind of work that you do and its appropriateness for being visualized, and of course, therefore, visual brokerage is not going to be useful. Understanding and thinking through what visual brokerage is and what it can bring to you helps you know whether or not it's going to fit. It's very much like, do you actually need that pie chart? You don't need that pie chart. Do you actually need that histogram? Well, does it actually fit in the flow of what I'm trying to do? So a lot of the knowledge that we're going through today and a lot of the points I'll make today mightn't apply to you, but now you know that they definitely don't apply to you, which is already quite useful. Next up is lack of motivation. We're all really, really busy. I'm impressed so many of you turned up today. It can be really hard to find the time in your day to do an additional task, let alone start to think about visualizations or an entirely new paradigm of working in terms of visualizations. It can seem like a lot of effort to either gain these skills yourself or bring someone in who has these skills. That's fair enough, but we're starting to move into a world where working on that third paper out of that project might actually be less useful to your career and less useful to the reach of your work than spending a bit more time actually focusing on the impact of the two papers you already have. So I do understand that it can be a bit of a paradigm shift, and sometimes it is a zero-sum game of, well, I have 4 hours, what do I spend those 4 hours on? But we're starting to move into a landscape where spending those 4 hours on the visual and thinking about visual brokerage might actually be more useful to you. Lack of time and skills. We are not Swiss Army knives. We have in research and in visual brokerage. So I don't know about you, but there are some tasks where they take me hours. I give them to a friend or a colleague who is more skilled in that area, and it's done in mere minutes. So for me, that's anything involving hard calculation, maths, that kind of stuff. So I have a friend who's astounding at that kind of thing, but when it comes time for her to make a simple figure, she'll sit there for hours. She'll get something nice at the end of it, but it takes her hours. So we just swap. Problem solved. We've both saved a lot of time by actually thinking about our relative skills and creativity and capacity to do something. Now in research, we're fantastic at this. We're really good at building teams with, okay, this is the stats person, and this is the English writing person, and this is the presentation person, and of course there's going to be some overlap there. What I'm advocating is think about bringing on the more visually skilled person. So it's one additional person, but then if you look at the person hours, that is, I do something for 5 hours, you do something for 5 hours, that's 10 hours on it. You actually have fewer person hours going into projects by leveraging the capacity of someone who can actually do this stuff. And with visual brokerage, this means bringing them on earlier, rather than at the end of a project, which means more time saving over the life of a project, assuming that it fits and you are motivated. Next thing is lack of resources. Well, I'm going to tell you about some resources a bit later on. So we do not have a big lack of resources. A lot of this stuff seems really hard because it's kind of like a monolithic way. How do I even begin to get into this? How do I make my own visual? How do I start to talk to other people who can make visuals? How do I bring them on? There's actually a lot of resources and support out there to help you try it out and see if it works for you. Before I go on to those resources and what you can do, and hopefully give you some tools that will allow you to start to think about the fit and how you might want to engage with this, do we have any questions or comments or even contradictions about how visualization, scientific visualization and visual brokerage fit together? You're either really persuaded or really not and just too polite to say so. Okay. So what you can do to make the most of thinking in this way. First of all is building good habits. Keep visuals as you generate them. So there was a review in, I do not have the year there, my apologies. There was a review a couple of years back, so it's not the most recent, of multiple research departments at the University of Griffith. And they found that researchers weren't in the habit of collecting visuals or multimedia content that they naturally generated in the normal course of their research. So a good example of this is every time you go out in the field and take a photo of the people that you're working with, if you're digging latrines, the latrine that just got dug, the place that you're staying, just for yourself to send to family and say, hey, this is what I'm doing, or maybe for your records, those are all visual assets that you could keep and potentially use down the track. You could engage with someone to respond to them creatively. You could use them in your publications. You could use them in your outreach. If you make a really beautiful figure, it's just a work in progress, but it's actually really beautiful. It tells a point that's too simple to maybe include in the main text of a manuscript, but it looks really nice, and you think it makes a really cool point. Don't file draw that, keep that. So we're very bad at just sort of haphazardly putting our images left, right, and centre. We're really good at cataloguing the text stuff and keeping records of the text stuff. So the first good habit is, if you're generating visuals as you conduct your research, keep it. You don't even have to do anything with it, but keep it just in case. Don't be shy if it's not beautiful. It's completely fine. Sometimes someone will draw, oh, it's really dodgy, I'll just draw this bird, and it's adorable. And it gets the message across. It doesn't have to be the perfectly rendered every single feather glistening in the starlight. If it's a sketch of a bird that's recognisably a bird and you're talking about birds, it's perfectly good enough. You might either want to share that yourself or later down the track talk to someone who can draw the beautiful shiny bird and say, hey, can you make this pretty? What matters is you already have the visual there that's tied to your thoughts, it's tied to the communication, the information and the accuracy that you wanted to convey at the time. Think about brokerage early. So the way that it works best is if you are talking to people who are thinking visually as early on as possible. The number of times I've been brought on, literally, okay, we got this paper published, the people, reviewer number 2, it's always reviewer number 2. Reviewer number 2 says we need a figure. Can you get it to us in the next 5 hours? Yeah, I could do that. but I'm probably going to get something wrong if I don't understand your research. I don't understand, okay, so here you say you did X, Y, Z to the blood samples. I don't know why you did that, so the way I depict it might be off as to why you did that. You're in a rush, so there's only so many iterations that we can actually do to depict the work the way you want, so at the end you might get the figure and everybody's happy that we all did our best, but you're alienated from how that looks, what it's actually telling the reader. The earlier in the process that you can start to think visually yourself, bring on people, it doesn't even have to be someone embedded in your team. Have a chat early on when you're thinking about your hypotheses, see what ideas can come out of that. The earlier that you think about it, the more the visual brokerage process can help you and your work and help you harness that power of the visual. You can build your network, so you can build networks between faculties and schools. This is a climate coaster. This was a collaboration between the Climate Change Research Institute and Jeff and Mitch, I believe, at the School of Art. I encourage all of you to look up the Climate Coaster project. It's a really cool example of how two completely different departments at ANU can come together and create something really, really cool. It can also be between individuals, so the paradigm of one person doing it all historically is now shifting toward a team. That team could consist of your artists over here and your scientists over here. You could get people who dabble in both fields. It's very much like you might get someone who's amazing at English and quite good at stats, but then you still have a stats lead who leads the stats, but then the other person can actually help you with your analyses. So think about the composition of the team as you think about the research. Of course, it's really useful to build your skills and your vocabulary. I'm separating out these two things very intentionally. The skills is where you're doing it yourself and pushing it as far as you can. The vocabulary is learning how to talk to other people who think and work visually. Very much like trying to talk to someone from an academic discipline you know nothing about. So if you go have a chat to people from physics or from the humanities, you might be talking about completely different things and not notice because your language is very different, and this can be the case when it comes to visualization. I've got an example of this coming up. Some of the places that you can go to build your skills are books. I always pimp this book. Please read The Visual Display of Quantitative Information by Tuft. It is a physically beautiful book. It is an informative book. I feel like everybody should just go out and get this book. If there's one book that you read when it comes to visualization, and particularly scientific visualization, this is the book that you should read. It's relatively short. It's really, really good. Online videos and courses. The internet's pretty amazing. There's Coursera courses, there's YouTube tutorials, there's Stack Exchanges. There's a lot of resources online if you want to do a particular thing to actually follow up and learn. Open source software, I'm just going to briefly in a moment walk you through some options for that. And then there's resources at RSPH and at ANU more broadly, which we will finish on. Something which puts a lot of people off is they ask, well, what software do you use to draw that? It's very much like in primary school, you're the one that's got the 30-pack of connector pens, and everybody with the 10 packs, I can't do that, I don't have the colours to do that. And you can teach them how to blend colours, and actually you can achieve very similar results. Often people are put off because I'm the one with the 30-pack of connector pens, I've got the Photoshop license, I've got the tablet. Actually, you can start out perfectly feasibly, so I'm going to explain the difference between raster and vector in a moment. But for now, you just need to know that for most of the visualizations that you will see, and certainly anything that I've ever done for any of you, probably was done in either Photoshop or Illustrator. For Photoshop, come a really long way. The two open source free alternatives are GIMP and Krita. The reason there's two is that Photoshop is both a painting and drawing, but also more of a compositing and filtering tool. So if you've ever dabbled in Photoshop, opened it up and drawn some lines with your mouse, that's the drawing bit. That's what Krita does amazingly well. If you've ever opened up Photoshop and wanted to crop a picture, change the color balance a bit, maybe change the contrast a bit, that's image editing, that's what GIMP does. Both of these softwares were kind of bad for quite some time, but they've gotten genuinely amazing. I'm still very much a Photoshop person because I got it, and if you've got a 30-pack and connector pens, you want to use all 30. But my partner is a very good artist and he relies purely on GIMP and Krita. So it's possible to get comparable, indeed I'd say even better results using these open source alternatives. I'm very much an Inkscape evangelist. It used to be very crash happy, it is not anymore. I love it to pieces. It is just as good as Illustrator, to the point that now if I have a choice between the two, I will actually prefer to use Inkscape. All of this software does have a bit of a learning curve, but of all of the vector illustration software I've ever seen, Inkscape is the easiest to use. So if you want to get started yourself, feel free to pick up a book, have a look online, and if you don't have Illustrator or Photoshop on your computer, pick up GIMP, Krita and Inkscape and have a play. That said, no, it can be a little bit like watching Bob Ross, where he starts to paint a painting and he's so calm and everything seems to work, and then you try it yourself and you end up with this horrible mess. Not everybody can follow the tutorials, and that is completely fine. It can seem almost impossibly difficult to hop up there and get started because you don't quite understand the software, you don't quite understand the principles underlying it. Whilst I always recommend that everybody should dive in and have a go, at least try to be, I understand that we are busy, we often don't have the time, and that is completely fine. So the next thing I'm going to briefly touch on is vocabulary. So if you want to pursue skills, that's amazing and great, and I really think that you should and take any opportunity that you can. If that really isn't for you, and this is how I'd react if someone said, come on, let's sit down and do matrix algebra. I really don't want to. So, at least I can talk to the person and understand what they're talking about once they've done the matrix algebra. So I'm going to use the term vector as an example. If I walked down the corridor and said, okay, tell me what a vector is, Darren would say something like, it's an agent that carries and transmits an infectious pathogen into another living organism. Ben would say something like, well, it's a one-dimensional array. Nick, who's just done some factor analysis, would say, well, it's a geometric object that has a magnitude or length and a direction. And our lovely artist Ali would say, well, it's images defined by geometric primitives as opposed to bitmaps. She'd probably say it in more human language. The meaning would be there. I immediately look at that and think, well, I can do you a vector of vectors with a vector. So a vector can be all of these things. Clarity is important. When you're talking to someone who's outside of your field, you often need to step back and actually define the terms you're talking about. It's not that they're slow, it's not that they're unintelligent, it's this that you could be using the same words to mean completely different things. The same thing goes for when you talk to an artist or a designer about your work. So if they start talking about vectors and you don't know which vector they mean, stop and ask them. If you say, I would like a vector, please be clear about what vector you want. The reason I use vector is not just because it means so many different things, but a fundamental concept when it comes to visualization is the idea of raster versus vector. These are both open source images. All of the sources are either on the slides or in the slide notes, so remember you've got to cite your images. So a raster is essentially a picture. If you zoom into something and you can start to see the pixels, it's a raster. A vector is a series of lines defined by mathematical operations. If you zoom right into a vector, you will never see pixels. Usually, most of the type you see on websites, PDFs, they are vector. If you've ever come across a journal article that you've downloaded and it's a strangely larger file size, and you use Control-F to find a thing and you can't find the thing, and then you zoom in and realize there's pixels between the letters, that means that it is a raster, not a vector. So raster are usually file formats like JPEG, PNG, and photos. The big thing is you cannot add detail to a raster. Once you've started at a particular size, if you start to zoom out and try and make it bigger, it's going to get stretched, you're going to start to see the pixels. This is really important to know because the number of times you start to draw something beautiful and it's exactly what they want, and then they say, okay, can we print it A3? No. No, we can't. We have to start all over again because at the very beginning we didn't have that conversation about, do you want a raster, do you want a vector, what are you going to use it for? So the key thing with raster images, and that's photos, is a principle called dots per inch. It's essentially how many pixels there are per inch to give detail. The higher the DPI, the larger the file size, but the higher the image quality and the larger it can be. You can go into this for hours and I'm happy to geek out with anybody who wants to talk about DPI or bit depth or anything like that, but the key thing that you guys need to know is there's two default DPIs. If you're working on a computer, you're at 72 DPI. That's what the screen projects for you. Most software like Word will automatically downsample an image to 72 DPI when you bring it in. So if you want to print a really lovely, large, high quality photo, don't send it to the printer in a Word document because it's already been downsampled. If you want something to print nice and crisp, think about the physical size of the image, so A4, A3, has to be 300 dpi or more. We need much higher detail for printing. The reason this is important is we don't work at 300 dpi or larger for everything all the time, because the file sizes get huge. It often gets downsampled on websites or in Word documents. But if you're going to print it, you need to think about that. So if anybody ever says, well, do you want a raster, and if so, what size, what dpi, it's quite important to think, what am I going to use it for? And know at the start, because you can't fix it at the end. Raster, on the other hand, are file formats like SVG, PDF. Text is a very good example. If you see text in almost any setting, it will be a raster. It has infinite detail, which is really nifty. You don't have to think about the size or the DPI. So I can make you a pretty little logo that goes on your pen, and then you can decide next week, actually I want that on the side of a building. And we can do it immediately on the side of a building with no problems whatsoever. The drawback of this is, as you can see from these two examples, the flea looks a lot simpler than the worm. You can get amazing colour depth, it takes a lot of time, but you can get quite a bit of depth out of a vector. But a vector is definitely more suited for line diagrams and things that are a bit like text in nature, visually. It takes a bit more effort at the start if you want to do something more complex, which means it'll take longer, but then it gives you more flexibility down the track. Whereas a raster, it's easy, you take a photo on your camera, you have that raster image there. So a few more helpful hints and tips for visual vocabulary. Think about who you're working with at the start. Is it a colleague who is in area? Is it a colleague who is out of area? An artist, a designer, or a member of the lay public? I like to think of them in a box. It's essentially someone who has very similar knowledge to you, or someone who might be using very different words. And the vector example is a good idea to think through here. What's the core message? So something that can be a little bit frustrating is people can come to you as an illustrator and say, I have this great idea. Here is my 20-page publication, and here's this painting I really like. Now the painting I really like is genuinely fantastically useful in the visual style that they want, and it can help you by hashing out things like colour schemes, format, great. But if you don't have a core message, there is no way that you can get a 20-page journal article into a single image. And as someone who's brought on often at the end of a project, you have no idea what the core messages are. So even if you're not quite sure and say, oh, well, I've got these 5 things that I want to tell people, which will be the best fit visually? Or ideally at the start of the project say, okay, what's a core message that you think from what we're developing would go well visually? Try and have your core message of what you want it to do sorted out before you talk to the art person, or hash it out with the artistic person, not just info dump, okay, make it pretty. Because often you can end up with something which is completely different from what you expected. Generally, the idea is an elevator pitch, so you hear this all the time. 1 to 2 sentences. If you were stuck in an elevator with someone who could fund your research for the rest of your life, but you only had 30 seconds, what would you tell them? That's the kind of way that you should be pitching the core message. Then you can come back and add more detail and add more thoughts, but to start with, that's a good way to go. Think about how the visualization will be ultimately displayed. This is where raster and vector is really important, to decide what it's for and how it's going to be displayed. Black and white versus full colour. So again, it seems like a small thing, but publication charges for colour are still a thing, and it can be absolutely maddening to make the most beautiful figure or outreach and then realise you don't have the money to pay the journal to have it in colour and you've got to redesign the whole thing, or colour printing is still pretty expensive and you need to redesign the whole thing to be black and white. So think about the possible usage and how the resources that you have for depicting it at the end. It's going to be viewed on screen, in print, or both. If it's going to be print or both, you should be working at a very large file size if it's a raster from the beginning. If it's on screen, it doesn't matter so much and you can work smaller and it's more convenient and it'll fit on an ANU email to the person rather than having to whack it on OneDrive or something. Is it going to be portrait, landscape, half column? This is where target journal requirements can be really handy if you're working on a visualization specifically for a specific journal. Again, it can be absolutely heartbreaking to have the most beautiful visualization that you love to pieces and then find out you've got to rotate it and everything gets squished. And it's just sad for everybody. So thinking about the way it's going to be displayed at the end helps curtail that. Is there anything that you do not want? You often get the I don't know what I want until I see what I don't. That's, to be honest, it's a little bit disrespectful to the visualizer or the designer. It's very much, unless you come to them immediately and say, look, I'm really lost, can you help me? It's very much like a granting agency saying, oh, what do you want to do? And a researcher saying, oh, well, I don't know. I could look at people. You've got to be specific about what you do and don't want, and just subliminally you don't want pie charts. Never do that. Please don't. I'm happy to give another seminar one day that's just all bashing on pie charts. So, thank you. Is there anything that you do want? So I used the example previously of a painting that you really like. Because we're talking visuals, the sky is somewhat the limit. As long as the technical content and the scientific accuracy is communicated within it, you can be very creative. So there's no problem whatsoever of saying, well, I'd like to do this bar chart, but I'm really inspired by Starry Night. Can we bring this together? Colour scheme, layout, look and feel. The sky is somewhat the limit when it comes to, I want it to look like this. And finally, is the visualization actually a good idea? I am a terrible culprit for this. I want at least 2 figures in everything that I do, and I'm heartbroken when I realize, okay, I've just spent 2 days trying to shoehorn this figure into the results section, supplementary materials. Now that's fine for me because I love doing the visualization, but if you find that challenging, if you're using someone else's resources to generate it, it can be a waste of everybody's time to make something that's beautiful, but it doesn't fit. Sometimes, and I really do hate to admit it, sometimes a text description or a table genuinely is the way to go. The red flag I generally have for this is if you sit down with someone where you've got someone with an artistic mind and a scientific mind, and in half an hour you can't come up with at least one idea for how it should look, possibly it's a bad fit and it's not going to work. So sometimes getting out early is actually part of the brokerage process. So we are moving on to our local resources. I've talked about what you can do, I've talked about how you can talk to other people. Here are some people you should talk to. We're going to run briefly through Vidya, Graphic, and then the Population Health Exchange and RSPH Comms team. I'm going to give you a very simplistic, brief overview of these people. If anything sparks your interest, please look up. All of them are easily searchable on their websites. Please look them up. Please start talking to these people, because really it's an amazing bunch of resources, and now I feel like I'm kind of big-upping myself because I'm part of one. But, great group of people. So first of all, we have Vidya. I'm going to read directly from the way these people describe themselves on their websites. It's Visual and Decision Analytics Lab. It's a service and research organisation combining expertise in visual analytics, which absolutely fits in the way I conceptualise visual knowledge brokering, and decision analytics. The Vidya's powerful approach creates new opportunities for better mental and public health planning. So particularly if you're thinking about planning and policy and mental health, fantastic resource. But more broadly, they have so much to offer, and it's great to get in touch, have a look at the kind of things that are going on. Next up is Graphic. They promote and facilitate the use of geographical information systems to inform relevant and equitable solutions targeting health resources and services in Australia. They aim to meet the needs of Australian health research by providing and maintaining research resources, services and consultancies. So an example of a resource service consultancy is a map that they very kindly generated for us literally just in this week. This is depicting daily cases of the coronavirus, just new cases each day from the 5th of February through to the 3rd of March. So this is the kind of thing that they can produce for you if you approach and essentially ask. It's both cool and depressing, but please focus on the really cool bit, and that is that this is possible, it's doable with relatively tight turnaround, and could be extremely useful for some of the work that is undertaken here at RSPH. Next up is the PH Exchange and Marketing and Comms people. You will see some of these people in the audience. Please accost us. We've got Ginny, me, Toby, Ali and Liz, and I was so happy to find out you can get all the support we can offer. Thank you. Thank you. So, Population Health Exchange. That's why I'm here. Hopefully that's part of why you're here. We provide resources for fostering partnership and knowledge co-production. Again, that's very much in the visual brokerage framework. Not just visual though, PH Exchange goes beyond that, but we've got a large visual bit. Among researchers and diverse stakeholders in order to achieve better health outcomes through evidence-informed policy and practice change. So an example of something that we did recently, which some of you were involved with, was the 10 things you can do to protect yourself and others from bushfire smoke infographics. That went really well, so that was very pleasant. Next up is our lovely marketing and comms people. This is a beautiful thing by Ali. Okay, pop quiz, vector or raster? Generated as a vector, and this is a raster. Hey! I'm assuming, please tell me. Okay, there we go. The comms team can help you with things like marketing and comms plans, content for the web, photography and videography, as is happening right now. Social media management, illustration, animation. The animation bit's really exciting. Event promotion and design. There's also some professional development opportunities, so it's not just hubs that you can go talk to, there's active things you can engage with. First up, some of you will have seen the flyers going around, 3-minute thesis time. Population Health Exchange and comms are going to have an RSPH information session in Bob Douglas. This isn't just about the visual stuff, but we will include some stuff there. So 3-minute thesis is a great mix of the verbal communication, but also you only get one slide. Let's make it a really beautiful slide. Now's a great time to get started. Did you want to say anything else on this?
Oh, just to ask who might like to come along to that. So 2 p.m. on the 16th, so it's the day that we've got the whole school meeting that afternoon. We just thought if we had 15 or 30 minutes, we can talk a bit more about what 3-minute thesis is and give some ideas about how you can get extra training and what we can offer as well, because we thought we could offer some local mentoring and so on. Just wondering who might be interested.
It's not many PhD students here
No.
right now.
And who's going to encourage their PhD students to do it? Can I have a show of hands of that? Thanks. And who might feel left out because they're not a PhD student and would still like to do some training on visualization and communicating in the way that a 3-minute thesis does? You try and make that elevator pitch. Is there anyone who would actually be interested in that outside of the 3-minute thesis? And on training, we thought we could offer a workshop maybe on Inkscape later in the year. Would people be interested in that? Yeah.
You absolutely should. Inkscape is wonderful.
Okay, thanks.
So also coming up, it's not all internal, there is a design and data visualization for knowledge translation workshop coming up at the Uni of Melbourne this month. The months go by so quick. So if you want more information, look up alanaperone.com.au/training and we will circulate these slides so you can go to that URL. And we're also probably going to bring in some external stakeholders like Stacey McCormick, does some fantastic visualizations, primarily vector, and she gives a really good workshop on the basics of how to use Inkscape. The main question that we have, particularly please give us feedback during question time, is given everything that I've told you, what would you like to see? What do you feel like you need that we could provide you to help you have a go, get started on this and potentially use more visualizations, get into the whole knowledge brokerage, visual brokerage landscape, and even potentially increase your vocabulary so you can make better use of some of the resources we already have here. So please walk up to Ginny or myself at the end and tell us what we can do for you. So in conclusion, visuals are really powerful. Scientific visualization gets that power and makes it informative. I think it actually enhances it because the technical content itself can also be very powerful. Visual brokerage is, in my opinion, the next logical step. It's the process of conceiving, creating, disseminating and interpreting knowledge via visual means. So it's taking scientific visualization and smooshing it right in there along the whole research process in a way that genuinely benefits everybody involved. And you got the resources either to skill up or get your vocabulary up or just to engage with this, ready for you to have a go. So thank you so much for your attention today. I welcome any comments, questions, or merely just pleased smiles. I'm happy with a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Erin. We've got time for 1 or 2 quick questions or comments.
I have one, Erin, fantastic. We are so lucky of having you here and having all this development on visualization. I have 2 questions. One is, what do you think of visualization as a research topic, of working on visualization, for publishing about visualization, developing the whole methodology, tools, etc. for the analysis? And the second is, what about training? How can we change this, how can we transfer this paradigm shift to the students at the school?
So for the first point, there is so much research in that area. There are some journals that are specifically dedicated to this, but I feel like it's still somewhat niche in that it's applicable to so much, and often people who are interested in visualization and the mechanics of doing it and applying it to problems get really excited and have great impact in their specific area, but you don't see someone from biology walking past and seeing some of that work and those analytical tools and saying, actually, I can apply what you've been doing with humans to animals. So I think that there's great scope, and it is slowly taking off, but there's so much more that can be done to broaden the appeal, which comes to your second question. Get them young. We should be teaching the undergrads this kind of thing. We should be, it so really saddens me how much of our education as academics is about the text, and the visuals are almost an oversight. So even in something like a microscopy course, where it's an inherently visual thing throughout the entirety of the research process, the potential for the visual to be used as a communication tool beyond the research process is somewhat limited. Now, happily, we're starting to get way better at that at AANU, but I think that we need to start to improve people's visual vocabulary earlier on in their education, and to have some really obvious case studies and say, hey, look, doing this is actually really, really helpful to you, and this is where people like Graphic Videa and hopefully population health exchanges, we continue, can really come into the fore, showing tangibly the benefit of thinking in this way.
Thank you.
Elizabeth?
Hi, thanks for your presentation. I just wanted to ask a question that's sort of been nagging me for a bit. It's really about intellectual property of these graphics, because in some cases we use it for media, but we can also use it for a journal, and when you say quoting a source, it might just be the website or something, but what about the artist or the designer that created it or collaborated with you? Do they get anything back from that? And when do we quote and when don't we?
So, excellent point. This is somewhat of a quagmire, particularly when it becomes unclear who actually owns the intellectual property. So one way to address this is to have the artists and illustrators, such as myself, whenever I make something for someone, whether it's here at RSPH or if it's a freelance commission, I always say, when I give you this image, I give you the research of the full intellectual property. You can use this, you can remix it, you can repurpose it, you can resell it. So the first step is, if you're generating this stuff, be just as clear as you would with the authorship list. The same way you sit down and say, okay, who contributed what? Start thinking about visuals in that way, and visuals can have multiple authors as well. You can say, well, generated by blah with assistance from blah. So if we start to think about the IP the same way that we think about authorship at the generation stage, that really helps. When it comes to whether or not a journal or media owns it, sometimes minor tweaks can be done. So you have your public outreach version and then your journal version, and they're different enough that the journal doesn't get curmudgeonly that you're using their IP because you gave it to them when you submitted it to the journal. So you can get a bit clever in terms of, okay, how can we use the same concept and have slightly different versions that are appropriate for different audiences that then avoids the dual use issue there. Due diligence is all you can really ask if you found a really cool thing on the web and you want to use it and it's not clear if it's open source or not. So there's some fantastic sources such as Wikimedia Commons and Unsplash, where you know everything there is openly licensed or has the right attribution and it's clear, and you can do that. But if you find something on Google for a presentation, you think that's great, as long as you do your best to try and trace it back to where it came from. So reverse image search is great for this. If you find something you like, reverse image search the URL, find the earliest example, and often that can be the artist's website or the textbook that it's included on. So as long as, I think most people feel if you do due diligence and try and trace it back as far as you can, that's all that can be asked. That said, it's a really bad idea to do that if you're going to include it in a scholarly publication, because it's kind of a dodgy grey area in your talks, and no one's really going to blame you for doing it in your talk. But if you're giving it to a journal and saying, I own the IP for this, make sure that you actually do. Does that help? Okay.
So, yeah.
All right, that's all we have time for, so please ask Erin or PH Exchange any questions later, but please help me in thanking Erin now for her presentation.
Thank you.